Hey guys, this is AP World History, Chapter 28, Revolutions and National States in the Atlantic World. Alright, so this chapter is exactly the way it sounds. It's all about the revolutions that occurred from starting about 1750 and later. So a couple of things to keep in mind. One, we are now in period 5, which is 1750 to 1900. So again, all the way from the revolutions up until World War I. This is the time period we're covering. And the other thing is to just really keep in mind when listening to the screencast about not only the revolutions, but how they have been inspired by each other to some extent, and also the kind of the political ideologies that develop because of that. So this will probably take a couple of videos because it will be pretty long. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is popular sovereignty and political upheaval. So it's really important to know that even before these revolutions start, you had something called the Enlightenment that occurred in Europe that really inspired a lot of the and most of the revolutions to happen. Okay, so the question, what inspired the revolutions? The Enlightenment inspired the revolutions. And the Enlightenment was this time of kind of thinking about people and thinking about how society functions and how we, at times agreed to let governments rule us. We are saying, yes, we're going to let you rule us. However, it's also recognizing the limits that that government has, that they can't have complete control. So philosophers during this time in the Enlightenment began to question nations of sovereignty. So they began to say, you know what, you're sovereign, meaning like you're in charge of your own country, your own nation, but what does that mean in terms of society? So one of the well-known philosophers of the Enlightenment was John Locke, and he said that individuals voluntarily formed society and established governments, and rulers derived their authority from them. So pretty much he's saying that we as people, we get together and form a society, and that we give permission for a government to rule us under this establishment. It's the idea of the consent of the governed, that we are giving, again, the consent. Remember, to give consent is to give permission. So we are giving permission for this government to rule over us. And that's what he believed. And then you also had another political philosopher, Voltaire, who called for religious toleration and freedom to express their views openly. So he was really big on not letting religion interfere with the government. That kind of this idea of separation of church and state, which you guys know now. And he felt that religion should really have no business in government, and that you should be able to believe whatever you want. So then we have this idea of political and legal equality. Many Enlightenment philosophers or philosophers called for equality among people, among the government. And they recommended a society where all individuals are equal before the law, meaning that just because you're rich doesn't mean that you're going to get a higher or more leniency in terms of the law, that all laws should apply to everybody equally. Now, given that your position might be able to allow you to have, a good lawyer, that doesn't mean that the law is not being applied to you. Then we had another Enlightenment philosopher called Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he said that members of a society are sovereign. In an ideal society, individuals would participate in the creation of the laws. Basically saying that you, as a part of the society you're in, you should have a right to create the laws that are going to govern you and that you're going to follow. So these ideas really, begin to inspire and challenge long established ideas. In this time, we're looking at countries that have kings and queens. And this is an absolute monarchy in some of these countries, like in France. And it begins to really question the authority of them and what gives these kings and queens right to have absolute control. And it kind of shakes things up in some of these countries. So revolutionary leaders were influenced by Enlightenment ideas. We'll see that in the American Revolution. We'll see that in the French Revolution, as well as the Haitian and Latin American revolutions that we cover. They were very much inspired by this idea of equality, by this idea of, kind of the government has to do what the people say, what the people want. That was a radical idea back then, that the government has to adhere to the people. So Enlightenment ideas influenced the organization of states and societies throughout the world. And probably the revolution, obviously, you're most familiar with is the American Revolution, occurred from 1775 to 1781. And this is just going to be a really brief history of the American Revolution, guys. We're not going to go into much detail here. So we first start with tightened British control over colonies. The North American colonists became disenchanted with the British imperial rule. For the British, these colonies were just property to them, ways to extract resources. But the people who were living here, remember, they were living here since 1607, since Jamestown. And we're talking about generations of people who have been living in this area who have no attachment at all to Britain. Some of these people had never even lived in Britain, never even visited Britain. To them, this was home. And for them, it was like, why am I listening to a country that's hundreds and hundreds of miles away and following their laws? So some of the reasons that the American colonists here were disenchanted were the geographic distance. Like I said, you're so far away. Why am I listening to you? An inefficient government, meaning that they weren't necessarily applying rule of law to the colonies as well as they should be. And of course, the big one, the taxation without representation. Okay, the idea that you just all of a sudden have decided to tax me, but yet I haven't had a say on whether I would want to be taxed or not, or whether it was even fair to tax me. So all these reasons are why these American colonists are upset. So it's going to force these colonists to write the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. And it was inspired, of course, by Enlightenment ideas, that it was thought to justify the quest for independence, that, you know what, you're not listening to me as a people, you're governing, you're governing at me and not letting me govern with you. So it echoed the idea of John Locke, and it was difficult to put independence to action because you had, the Brits who had many advantages, who were living in these areas, and, they were gaining wealth and they had property, and they felt some of them had loyalties. Those people were called the loyalists, who had loyalties to the British flag, whereas you had other American colonists who felt nothing towards them and felt that, America was their own land and that they should fight for it. And these were called the Patriots. So when they began to fight with the British for their independence, they got a lot of support. The Americans, the Patriots, got a lot of support from foreigners such as France, Spain, Netherlands, and German principalities. And don't think it was because, oh yeah, we're going to support you because you're doing the right thing and we want to help you. No, it was never that. It was never, just out of the kindness of their heart. There were underlying tensions already existing between these foreign countries that helped us and the British. So for them, it was like, if we take out, or we get rid of these colonies that the British own, meaning we help them to become independent, then that's going to be a big hit on Britain, and that's going to let us, these other foreign countries, make it more available and accessible to economic prosperity. So again, don't think that these foreign countries were helping to be nice, because they weren't. They had their own ulterior motives to it. So once they did help us, and finally the US breaks free from British rule, we have a constitution that is going to develop. And the constitution is big on emphasizing those Enlightenment principles, these ideas of individual rights. And the government was based on popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty, again, is that idea where the people are ruling. The people are helping to make the laws and make the decisions for the country. Okay? And that's really how the Enlightenment inspired the American Revolution. The idea that we are fighting for our individual rights, for our freedoms. And because of this, we're also going to create a constitution that reflects that as well. So like I said, very quickly, that was essentially the American Revolution. We're going to move on to now the French Revolution. So the French Revolution will happen after the American Revolution from 1789 to 1799. And it's different in that the American Revolution was independence from another country. The French Revolution was internal revolution, meaning that they needed to fix themselves. Not that they were trying to break free from somebody, but that they needed to fix what was wrong within their own country. So really, we have to start at the beginning with, before the revolution even starts, something called the Estates General. So in France, you had a fiscal problem that occurred, and France was in debt, and they were in debt mainly because they helped the U.S. beat the British. That's a big reason why they were in debt. So what ends up happening here is that they need to figure out how to get out of debt. And so the king, King Louis XIV, had to call a meeting of the Estates General. Now, what is the Estates General? The Estates General is basically their structure of government. There were 3 estates. The first estate was the Roman Catholic clergy, so the priests, essentially. The second estate were the nobles, the aristocrats, the wealthy. And the third estate was everybody else. The serfs, the free peasants, the urban residents. And all estates have some number of the same number of votes, though the third estate had more people. Okay, so think of it. Estates 1 and 2 have the least amount of people. Maybe together they would make 2% of the population in France. And the third estate had the 98% of people. And they all get 1 vote. And you need to consider, do you think that's fair? Do you think that's fair that, the 2% gets the same weight as the 98%? So they call the Estates General into session to authorize taxes. So like I said, they were in debt. How do we fix this? How do we fix being in debt? They had to call this assembly because it had to be agreed upon as to what they were going to do. Majority rules, obviously. So when they called this estate, pretty much what the king said, or what everybody agreed, was that we're going to tax the 98% again, and we're really not going to heavily tax the other 2%. Well, the clergy doesn't get taxed at all. The priests don't get taxed. So that means the nobility, who has all the wealth, is really not going to get taxed either. But most of it's going to fall on the third estate. So obviously, you can imagine how they voted. First estate said, well, yeah, we're not getting taxed. So go ahead, raise the taxes. Second estate was like, we're not going to really get taxed either. Third estate, where everybody else was like, yeah, we kind of have a problem with that. So they asked and they called for a reform. The third estate demanded reform and said, you know what, this isn't fair, and we're going to leave. We're going to secede from the Estates General, and we're going to claim ourselves as the National Assembly, pretty much wanting to establish a new government. And what these people did in the third estate is they attacked and they stormed the Bastille, which was like kind of a fortified prison, a military garrison, and it was the military garrison protecting the Bastille surrenders, and they promulgated or created the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So this was kind of like their new constitution. And when they created this, they were guided by the American Revolution principles calling for equality for all, popular sovereignty, and individual rights. Those were the things they were asking for in their declaration. Okay, in their declaration, they said we all have to be equal. We have to have the people making the decisions, and we all have to have individual rights. So what ends up happening is that the National Assembly will want to abolish the old social order of the first estate, second estate. So they'll get rid of the peasants. They got rid of fees of the peasants. So peasants were no longer to pay these fees. They got rid of the first estate, pretty much saying, you know what, you as priests and nuns and everything, you don't have a say in how this government works. And the clergy were seen as citizens of the state. You're just like everybody else. And the king is still the executive, but he has no legislative authority, which means that he has no power to make any laws or pass any laws. So France for a time became a constitutional monarchy, meaning that yes, you have the king at the top, but it's really the legislative body who is making these decisions, okay? When I say legislative body, in case you don't know, that's kind of like our version of Congress here in the United States. So continuing on with the French Revolution. So we have something called the convention that establishes. So what happens is that we have this National Assembly. They think they do great. All right, we fixed our government and this and that. And it takes a turn. It takes a really bad turn for the worse. And the revolution is going to become more radical, and people are going to have crazier ideas about what they should do with France and the country. So French nobility attempts to get foreign help. So what ends up happening here is that France kind of sees like what's going on, and they're kind of like, crap. The French nobility is kind of like, crap, we need help because people are turning on us. The regular people are turning on us, and they try to get help from other countries. And it forces the National Assembly to declare war on Prussia, Spain, Britain, and Netherlands. These are the countries that are they are asking for help from. Okay, and so now we have this National Assembly who's calling for war against these other countries. And then we have counter-revolutionaries who start the assembly known as the convention. All right? And this is kind of like, so the National Assembly is gone. Imagine it like that. The National Assembly's gone. The convention takes over. And these are like the radicals. And they abolish the monarchy. They begin to use the guillotine. So the guillotine is like up here where they chop the head off of the person and stuff like that. And Maximilien Robespierre will lead the convention for a time. Okay, and he's just kind of like this crazy guy who totally wants to change France. And he creates something called the Committee of Public Safety, where they campaign they have a campaign of terror. So pretty much anybody who's speaking out against the revolutionaries, speaking out against the convention, they find you, they pretty much give you the guillotine, and they force the citizens to go and look at you being killed so they can establish that fear, that reign of terror. And they promoted something called the cult of reason, which kind of pretty much changed everything, even time, calendars, everything. So what ends up happening, so we had the National Assembly, thought we did great, all right, got it figured out. That doesn't work out. The convention comes in. They go to the extreme, okay, and they are unable. The convention is unstable, and it will lead people to undermine them. So the convention will arrest Robespierre because they're like, you know what, this dude is crazier than we thought. They'll arrest him, and then another group will come in, and they'll be known as the Directory. So the new group of conservative men take over the convention and start the Directory, another government, okay? So we've already gone through the original government of the Estates General. We've already gone through the National Assembly. We've already gone through the convention, and now we're here at the fourth government with the Directory. All right, and the Directory, again, they're also unable to solve the social and economic problems that exist in France. And so enter in Napoleon Bonaparte with the coup d'etat. So Napoleon, very famous general at the time for France, and he feels he can do a better job. He feels that he can really get France to where they are. So he will do a coup d'etat, which means like a takeover of the government, and he will take over. So this will be the fifth government we see. Again, the Estates General, the National Assembly, the Convention, the Directory, and now we have the reign of Napoleon. And Napoleon will take it back to where he is pretty much a total monarch. So Napoleon brought political stability to France. So believe it or not, a lot of the stuff he did, it actually worked, and it actually helped France to kind of get back on its feet. He made an agreement with the Roman Catholic Church, known as the Concordat, where you were going to pay the cleric salaries. They're going to prefer the Roman Catholic Church and retain the land. So the church kind of comes back into good graces with the French government through this Concordat, and they got a lot of their privileges back. And this will win the support, obviously, of the priests, and they'll also support Napoleon because of this. Napoleon will also promulgate a civil code that stabilized society. So he'll create a bunch of laws that are going to create discipline and structure and order back in society. He will have a merit-based society, meaning if you're going to be in government, it's because you have the ability, not because you know somebody. And he will let opponents return to France. So those that were speaking out against the governments that existed in France, he'll let them return. And he, even though he did all these great things, he did, limit free speech. You couldn't speak out against Napoleon. He had secret police to kind of, take track of anybody who was speaking out against him or his regime. And he had the use of propaganda to promote himself as this wonderful, amazing king. So Napoleon's empire. So here's where Napoleon may have gone wrong. He wanted to extend authority throughout Europe. For him, he was going to have a grand European country. Every part of Europe he wanted. So the Iberian and the Italian peninsulas, he began to attack them. The Netherlands, Austria, Prussia. He was attacking all of these areas. All right. And he was winning, and he was gaining, recognition and conquering these areas. And then you'll find out Russia will be the one that is the hardest to get in war. He will attempt to attack Russia. And he went to the capital, and everyone was gone, and it burned down. And the reason that Napoleon lost was not because he did not have the forces. It was because he did not have adequate supplies and housing for his people. Meaning that they were not prepared for the cold winter. They were not prepared for the temperatures that Russia had. And because of this, he was unable to take Russia, and he lost a lot of his army because of this. So the fall of Napoleon, opponents of Napoleon take advantage, and they force him to abdicate his throne because he'd lost so many people. They thought now's a better time as any to pretty much, get our land back and fight back for our land. So they did that, and in addition to that, they force him to step down, to abdicate his throne. He'll step down. They will send him to an island, Elba, off, the European land, and he will attempt to he will come back to France, and he will gain power for 100 days. And then the British army will come in and defeat him at the Battle of Waterloo, and once again, they will finally send him to an island of St. Helena, where he will pretty much live out the rest of his days. All right, so that is the French Revolution, probably the most complicated of all the revolutions. But it's very important that you understand the underlying principles of it, and that was that these people, the French people, were wanting to have some control in their own government. And for a brief moment, they had it with the National Assembly, and then it all kind of went to crap. And then Napoleon kind of brings it back, but it was too authoritarian, too totalitarian under his rule, and he got too greedy. And he will fall because he doesn't have the forces to compete against everyone else. All right, so this is going to be the first half of the screencast. Again, just think about how these Enlightenment principles have reflected in these revolutions in the American and the French.